Good morning, everyone. My name is Luke Nixon-Jansen, Director of Marketing and Business Development of Magnet at Ryerson University. Magnet is a technology platform offering businesses, job seekers, and communities tools and resources to help them understand and thrive in our changing labor market. To start, we would like to thank the Canadian Chamber of Commerce for this opportunity, our fellow sponsors, and everyone who's joined us here today. Today's keynote speaker is Dr. Parag Khanna, founder and managing partner of FutureMap and author of the new book, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us. Dr. Khanna's keynote presentation today will be followed by a discussion with John Stackhouse, Senior Vice President, Office of the CEO at RBC, on trends affecting the future of work. First, both to introduce our speakers. So Dr. Khanna is a global strategy advisor, world traveler, and best-selling author, and resident of Singapore, actually. He is the founder of FutureMap, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm, and a graduate of the London School of Economics, where he obtained his PhD. Dr. Khanna was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured on Wired's Smart List. The author of 7 books, his latest is Move, which explores how humanity will navigate a new age of mass migration driven by climate change, technology disruption, and economic collapse. In Move, Dr. Khanna presents a vision of human civilization that is both mobile and sustainable. And today, Dr. Khanna will discuss his new book and how the desire for resources and stability combined with innovations in technology will affect the future of work. Dr. Khanna will also touch on the changes governments, businesses, and post-secondary institutions will need to embrace to attract the skilled workers needed to sustain our workforce. As mentioned, John Stackhouse is the Senior Vice President at the Office of the CEO at Royal Bank of Canada. John is also a best-selling author and a Senior Fellow at the C.D. Howe Institute and the Munk School of Global Affairs. John's latest book, Planet Canada, How Our Expats are Shaping the Future, explores the influence of Canadians living abroad. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Khanna.
Hello, everyone. This is Parag Khanna. I'm delighted to be joining you to talk about my new book, Move, and more specifically, the war for global talent in a warming world. I'll start by giving a few slides as an overview and looking forward to the subsequent conversation. So the first point I'd like to make is that we live in a very complex world in which, as I say here, you don't get to pick your crisis. You may remember in early 2020 when the great lockdown happened and suddenly the skies cleared over parts of India that had been highly polluted and elsewhere. And we thought to ourselves, maybe one fringe benefit of the lockdown is that we will help to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and make a dent in solving global warming. Well, of course, that's not what happened. Right, 2020 witnessed record temperatures, of course, and other climatic disasters, meteorological events, and so forth. And it turns out that, of course, we cannot neatly separate the pandemic, climate change, the labor shortages that our economies have experienced as a result of the lockdowns, continued political polarization, and other sorts of, political deterioration at the same time. All of these forces are always colliding simultaneously, and that's the nature of complexity. So what I wanted to do actually with this project is to try to explore the future of human geography and answer the question, where will we live in the year 2030, 2040, and 2050 in light of these colliding megatrends of the demographic imbalances, meaning the gap between old and young within countries and internationally, continued political unrest, and that could be, again, civil violence, international conflict, state failure, but also even political polarization at home. Economic dislocation can take multiple forms. It can be people being driven away from their geography of work as a result of automation or outsourcing, or also the new opportunities that remote work creates and that allows people to change their geography more voluntarily as well. And finally, of course, climate change, which has now become the single biggest driver of human migration by the numbers year on year. And multiplying all of that by the vast connectivity networks that we have built in the world, the infrastructure that unites us, that enables people to be mobile, which is why I forecast that coming out of this great lockdown, will be the next great migration. But the question is where, and to what degree climate change and demographics play a determinative role in where people will be going. Well, if you look at the most dire, but in this, the more we see these forecasts, the more we have to accept them almost as the likely, the most probable scenario, is that temperatures are rising rapidly, and what that is doing is making the maps, or the parts of the map here colored in red, less suitable for human habitation, and the areas colored green more suitable. You can see, of course, Canada is quite well positioned, as is Europe and Russia and other parts of the world. But note where most of the human population lives today is, of course, in areas that are going to be significantly heat stressed, water stressed, and face other kinds of climate challenges. And of course, this is not an all or nothing scenario that simply occurs when you flip a switch in the year 2040. We are already very much in this world as it is becoming the colors in a way that you see on this map. Again, red does not mean utterly unlivable, but it means decreasingly suitable for human habitation. And if you look at for example, the droughts or the so-called zero-day events where cities run out of water, in just the last 2 years, that's afflicted major cities like Sao Paulo in Brazil, Dakar in Senegal, Chennai in India, Cape Town, South Africa, and so forth. So, we clearly are not prepared for this scenario environmentally. And so the question I ask again is, what is the future of human geography? Where inevitably, inexorably, will people be shifting and moving despite the political obstacles that resist human migration today? The second factor to be considered in terms of the big picture backdrop is demographics. We are at a very significant inflection point that no one alive today could really ever have imagined during the 20th century, because during the 20th century, the world population actually quadrupled to the 8+ billion people that it is today. But fertility began to taper off in the 1970s. And we're seeing the effects of that now with this scenario that we are rapidly approaching that I call peak humanity, which is to say that potentially as early as the year 2040, we will reach less than roughly 9 billion people. And that will be the maximum number of people that will ever live on this earth, as far as anyone can imagine. And this is coming much sooner than anyone would have expected, given the trend line of the 20th century. Now, you might say this is a very positive thing with respect to climate change, but still, even the resource consumption of 5, 6, 7 billion people is what drove the climate scenario that we're in right now. So even reaching 9 billion people does not mean that we'll suddenly solve climate change. We will need a huge amount of investment in more sustainability to maintain that population. But in fact, because our children are not having children, the world population is likely to begin to decline quite suddenly after that peak humanity moment. You'll note that, you'll recall that there have been 2 major baby busts in just the last dozen years. After the financial crisis, fertility plummeted, and the same thing is what we're going through right now with the pandemic. The second great baby bust. Now, 2 baby busts within basically a decade of each other is a very significant global demographic phenomenon. It is a big deal. And it is accelerating what I have pointed here as the rapid decline scenario trend line, where again, the population of the world will not likely even reach 9 billion people. Now that leads to, of course, a huge, sort of irony, if you will. Northern societies, OECD countries, Canada very much an exception, tend to be extremely weary of mass migration. But given the aging populations, and this includes Canada, without immigration, your populations would actually be declining. So the irony is that the countries with the highest dependency ratios between old and young are also the places that actually need the most migration, but by and large have been quite resistant to it. And therefore, the question I ask is whether today's populism and xenophobia will actually give way to a war for young talent. because there is basically a finite stock of young people in the world who are going to be the workers, the entrepreneurs, the caregivers, the home builders, the renters, the occupiers. All of that is the tax base of the future, is what you need. And without young people, of course, a society almost by definition will die. So I do think that the more countries realize this, the way Canada has, the more this war for talent will become a global one, and we'll see, in a way, a reversal of today's populism and xenophobia. And therefore, what I do in this book is to focus on youth demographically, very much as a subject, not just as a marketing object, as a generation to which to sell things on Facebook, but rather to understand their psychology, their sociology, their geographic distribution, their priorities, their values. Where do they want to go? What do they want? And where they actually do wind up going as they vote with their feet will literally determine the winners and losers of the 21st century. And again, this is, we talk about an aging world, and of course, many societies are aging, but the majority of the human population is still, young, under the age of 40. So their movements over the next couple of decades will absolutely be decisive in terms of, again, determining the winners and losers of the future. Part of this is what I call get them while they're young. Look at students and the war for young students and talent, because when you recruit a student, of course, that person can eventually become a loyal citizen contributing to society. And, education, therefore, is central. And it has been a very competitive arena, and the US has outright dominated. But ever since 9/11, 20 years ago, that started to change. We've seen that there is a more vigorous competition with Canada rising very high up the ranks. And of course, on a per capita basis, Canada has far more foreign students than the United States does. European universities have been changing their medium of instruction to English to compete for, tuition paying, cash-rich Asian students. And so forth, even Japan in particular as well. So I view this as a very, sort of vigorous competition that's underway. And of course, it's very important for the retail economy, for real estate, for the educational sector, and eventually, of course, for innovation and entrepreneurship. So here too, I applaud what Canada is doing. And what you see as well is that in the surveys and rankings of expatriate destinations or global destinations for a world that is increasingly remote in terms of remote work, Canada has also been performing very well in this survey. Canada topped the US most recently. This is BCG's survey. You also find that this is becoming more and more global. Asian countries like Japan, Australia, Singapore, New Zealand have been considered, more or less safer havens, if you will, during COVID. And of course, there's a lot of other considerations that people take into account around the pathway to permanent residency or citizenship, labor laws and worker rights, and of course, cost of living and so forth. What's so interesting to me is that in this war for young talent, it does apply to really all segments of the value chain today. Lower skilled, medium skilled workers. One of the protagonists, if you will, in my book is the Filipino nurse. If you know anything about your own healthcare system, including that of the US, Gulf countries, Europe too, everyone is fighting for the Filipino nurse. I sort of herald the Filipino nurse as the Lionel Messi of the healthcare profession. There's a competition to get them. The Chinese want the Filipino nurses, the Japanese want them, the Germans want them, Americans, Canadians, the Emiratis, everyone wants Filipino nurses. The country could not possibly produce nearly enough, which is why you might want to be investing in healthcare worker training academies in India, where there is a good 400 million young women who are potential trainees for this profession. And it also, spans IT specialists and highly skilled people as well, all of which are becoming, more mobile professions. So remember that even in non-tradable services, you need to be importing the labor force to fulfill those functions, especially the ones that are not actually being automated anytime soon, despite prognoses, to the contrary. Just look at the UK's current trucker shortage of 100,000 people, 100,000 truck drivers. It's all fine and good to say that you will have automation and driverless cars in the next 10, 20 years. But it doesn't really help Great Britain right now to solve their terrible post-Brexit migration policy. So again, as I said, all rungs of the value chain, countries have to assess exactly what skills they need, at what level they need them, what geographies, what salaries, what countries of origin, develop those relationships and those pipelines. And again, something Canada is doing extremely well in terms of either poaching Americans and foreign talent in America, given the sort of concerns about the stability of the H-1B visa program and other factors, but also becoming an attractive place for remote workers, because you have to keep in mind, as Simon Cooper of the FT said very cleverly here, if you can do your job from anywhere, someone anywhere can do your job. And despite the previous Trump administration's efforts in the US to buy American and hire American, what you found, of course, is that Wall Street banks and consulting firms expanded their footprint of outsourcing to India precisely during the pandemic, knowing very well that in a world of remote work, what Simon has said is absolutely true. So you also have to make your country an attractive place, an affordable place to live, so that remote workers want to be there rather than someplace less expensive, with better weather, one might say. What is the big picture here? We have a situation where the world population has settled into fairly stable regional, intra-regional migration patterns. And these are the largest clusters of human migration in the world over the last 30 years. Former Soviet Union, Africa, Southeast Asia, South Asians in the Gulf countries, within Western Europe, and of course, from Latin America into North America. Now, bear in mind what I showed you earlier about the climate map, and also the one, of course, that hangs behind me right here on my wall. We can't view this purely as a technical exercise. There is the climate variable today, which is becoming very significant in people's calculations. In real estate markets, young people are very clear that they don't want to buy a home unless it's in a climate resilient area. These are not considerations that were a big deal for earlier generations. So we have to factor in youth as the subject and protagonist with their own sets of values around what kinds of places they want to be in, the climate factor that is sorting the world into livable versus unlivable places, the policy angle around which countries are doing the best job in attracting the talent that they need in a way that gives those young people stability. All of those factors are at play at the same time for governments and businesses making their considerations. What I do in the book Move is not only to talk through all of these policy issues and megatrends, but also geographically identify the places that I call the climate oases of the future. And it's a much broader set. This is a schematic with some stars and patchy zones to roughly explain some of the geographies that I cover and tour in the book. So I talk about various parts of Canada. Europe, again, performs very well, as Canada does, in terms of future climate or microclimate stability. Parts of Russia, less politically friendly, of course, but livable nonetheless. And other sort of corners of the world that I profile, not only for their climate resilience, but ultimately, of course, for their capacity to absorb more people and their policy environment that does so. Now, I want to conclude by saying that, in a world of only 9 or less than 9 billion people and a global terrain, a habitable terrain on the planet Earth of 150 million square kilometers, our human geography is not a question of how to manage overpopulation. Right? There are parts of the world that are overpopulated, but we're actually, again, reaching peak humanity. So we have a distribution problem. Our challenge, and the challenge that I've set for myself, is to achieve a more optimal and productive and sustainable and humane distribution of 9 billion people across 150 million square kilometers of terrain. It's eminently doable if we didn't live in a world of such political and cultural boundaries as we do today. And my aim is to provide a roadmap, both intellectual, moral, and literally geographical, for how we would do this kind of resettlement. But it's only one scenario out of 4 scenarios in the book. And quite frankly, 3 of the 4 scenarios in the book are quite negative, quite dire. So we have to think very hard and work very hard to lead by example in bringing about this global transformation towards what I call, and what I'll continue to describe in our conversation, a civilization 3.0. You'll be pleased to know that Canada, as I've, I guess, hinted, does come about as close close as any place in the world to living up to those ideals. But it's not enough. We have a long road and a choppy road ahead of us to get the rest of the world to think and act the way Canadians do. So thank you very much. Looking forward to the conversation.
Well, thank you so much, Parag, with fascinating points. And we really want to continue that conversation. I'm thrilled, therefore, to welcome John Stackhouse, Senior Vice President, Office of the CEO at RBC. John, thank you for being with us today. And thank you very much to RBC for your generous support of the Canadian Chamber. John is going to be chatting with Parag about some of the trends that Parag just touched on in his presentation. And John, we're really looking forward to this discussion. Over to you.
Thank you, Catherine, and Parag, great to connect with you again, even if it's virtual.
Great to see you, John. Thanks so much.
Parag, you've just been traveling parts of the world, Europe extensively. What struck you as the biggest difference?
Well, I mean, the normalcy of it all, right? After this extraordinary period, we've just been through the most, extensive and suppressive, lockdown in human history, at least in terms at a coordinated global level. But Europe has maintained that unity, if you will. I was, crossing borders every other day, and you take a quick PCR test here and there. But civic life is back, street life is back, pedestrian life is back, and it really did feel normal and thriving in many ways. Of course, that's what downtown, urban cores can be like. They'll be the first to bounce back unless it's an area that's been ecologically, devastated. But I was really, heartened and relieved.
Your presentation and, of course, your new book, Move, gets into the phenomenon of migration and how it could be quite different after the pandemic. We're speaking with a business audience, and there's a lot of concerns about lack of people, labor shortages, and in fact, there may not be enough migration even within regions. As you see the world opening up, are you seeing people moving literally in different formations or patterns than we've become accustomed to over the last number of decades?
It's such an interesting question because sometimes we forget that actually, despite the lockdown, a lot of people are still moving back, moving home. The largest movement of people during the lockdown was, in fact, South Asian construction workers in the Gulf countries moving back to India and Pakistan. To this day, as we speak, there's still a queue for Kiwis to return to New Zealand, because they have to wait until there's enough hotel spaces in the official quarantines and so forth. And maybe they'll never go back. Maybe, this is it. It's the end of their version of Aussie walkabout, because they realize that New Zealand's kind of the perfect place to be as the rest of the world goes mad. So there's that. And then some of the things that I talk about in the book involve the new directions, the new vectors, right? Because historically, and you rightly mentioned regions, we tend to migrate within regions. And of course, there's large exceptions to that, like South Asians in North America, but that's not tens of millions yet. Whereas if you look at, some of the totally new patterns that will emerge because of climate change, I'm talking about the possibility of tens of millions of South Asians moving north into Central Asia and Russia and other parts of the former Soviet Union, larger population transfers across Eurasia, because in a way what you've already seen is a significant number of Chinese and Indians and others that have now kind of planted roots in Europe. And I think that's going to increase given their density of their economic ties. And this is new stuff. It would be the first time that you would have 5 to 10 million, South and East Asians in Western Europe. It's never happened before, right? So we're entering a pretty novel phase when it comes to the kind of ethnic intermingling that is going to take place in this century.
Touch on the challenges of receptivity. We're seeing a backlash against immigration. This isn't a new phenomenon, but it does seem to be a little more acute as we come out of the pandemic. Certainly tensions again on the U.S. southern border, more debate in Europe, as you well know. Do you see that becoming a greater force as the world opens up, or will we become more comfortable with intermingling and greater migration?
Right, probably a lesser force, quite frankly. And let's be clear that I think factually, objectively, analytically, we give more attention to the backlash against immigration than it matter-of-factly deserves. Because if it were such a powerful force, it would have at some point actually prevailed and prevented the continuous mass migrations that we've been experiencing. Yes, it is true that as a matter of political compromise, Angela Merkel reduced the massive inflow of Syrians and other refugees in 2016 from the 1.x million to just tens of thousands. And but however, look at what she achieved. We just had another election in Germany last month. And of course, the right-wing parties were vanquished, disappeared off the map. And instead, you now have a center-left, or really a left coalition that's relatively pro-migration. So whenever we talk about Western publics getting, worried about mass migration, I said, please specify, because Hungary and, the five-star movement in Italy don't speak for Canada, and they don't speak for Joe Biden, and they don't speak for Germany. And dare I say, those are far more important and representative societies. So, as you know, I'm always tipping my hat to Canada for remaining very consistent on this. 10 years from now, when it comes to demographics, now not when we talk about America, 10 years from now, we'll look back and we'll say, Trump who? Again, not with respect to political polarization, because that's, baked in and he's made it worse, but with respect to demographics. And we have the data to prove that, because the census just came out. America became more diverse, more Latino, more mixed race, all under Trump's nose. And Biden is planning on expanding the H-1B visa quota, allowing spouses of migrants to work, document a pathway to normalization, citizenship for 13 million undocumented migrants. So yes, there's the crisis on the southern border, right? But that too is not representative of the broader thrust of American immigration policy. So, I think on balance, we should give attention where attention is due to the fact that we are mass migration societies. We have been either for centuries in some cases or decades in other cases, and it's working and it's worked.
Parag, talk a bit more about the Canadian advantage. It's certainly an advantage for the country, but arguably also for employers. A lot of people listening to this conversation. You have a wonderful global perspective. Give us a sense of how Canada stands out and is perhaps a little more different in the world going through the 2020s.
Well, some of it, of course, is geography, and I've spent some time in articles that I've written kind of comparing the divergent trajectory of Australia and Canada, two resource-rich Antipodean, countries that have followed a similar economic trajectory, but I see a significant divergence owing to, in Australia, of course, climate change will have a much more negative impact, of course, than it does on Canada. And they are an island, and their immigration policy now is very restrictive, and they do have a backlash there. So in many ways, you're no longer fraternal societies the way, or at least in fewer ways than you were before. So the Canadian advantage also is again, having this consistency and openness. I put myself through the Canadian points-based application system just as a research item, for the purposes of this book, and I scored very low. Even though I have a PhD, but I'm 44 years old, and the system is rather ageist. I used to be the young guy, it was kind of like a strange experience. But if you're like a 20-year-old Brazilian, you're off the charts, So, but again, at least it's clear and transparent, and Canada wants young people, and you're investing in affordable housing. Your immigration journey begins day one when you arrive. The new job creation, this is something you know very well, is mostly in a full-time employment. So the gig economy is less of sort of precarious risk to people, the good labor regulation. So there's so many things, and here's the important thing that I just want to mention. Young people pay attention to these things. They're not waiting for the old guys, you or me or others, to tell them and to market our systems to them. They're unbelievably shrewd and savvy. The protagonists of this book are the 4.5 billion young people of the world, and they've got this thing called the internet, and they've got message boards and chat groups and WhatsApp and friends and family, and relatives and the grapevine, and they know. what the advantages are these systems, and their heads are a perpetual cost of living calculator around where to go and where's the work, and where can my skills be useful and how do I apply, and let's do it. That's how young people are.
What is that 20-year-old Brazilian looking for?
Well, it could be admission to, a community college, a vocational program. He's going to be working and studying at the same time to afford it. He doesn't want to go back to Brazil other than on a holiday, right? He would love to have a Canadian passport. He's gonna work hard as immigrants do, and he's gonna fall in love with someone of probably a totally different ethnic group, and he'll contribute to Canada becoming even more of a polyglot mixed race society. That's what he's already doing. That's what all of the young immigrants in Canada are doing, and they'll continue to.
As we've all seen through the pandemic, technology is accelerating a whole bunch of changes, good and bad. And there is much debate about the work from anywhere, WFA, phenomenon, which some people may say becomes a counter-argument to your thesis, that migration matters less because we can indeed work from anywhere. How are you thinking through those competing forces of physical movement and virtual access?
I mean, it matters more than ever, actually, because if you think about every remote worker as an investor, then you're competing for those investors. And so if you are America and you're losing your best and the brightest because they want to go live in Panama, you just lost a taxpayer, and that's why instead of, before the pandemic, how many countries had nomad visas? Like 2. Today there's 75 countries who have them. So there is already an all-out, no holds barred war for talent underway in the world today. No question about it. So you don't want to be losing your workers. So you don't want to say, oh, well, it's remote work anyway. It's not about place. Of course it's about place, because people will change their citizenship. They'll relocate. They'll start companies elsewhere in other jurisdictions, and they'll deprive you of tax revenue and give their investment elsewhere. So there's no question that geography still matters immensely.
How do employers and even countries think about playing to their strengths in that kind of competitive environment when not just individuals, but we're seeing teams of people, especially highly talented people, do some jurisdiction hopping? What do you think are going to be the competitive advantages for that high-skilled talent in the years ahead?
Oh, so I mean, they get to dictate their terms, so to speak, right? And you're seeing this in the current tug of war over highly skilled talent. So imagine company A says everyone has to return to headquarters. The boss wants you reporting for duty on Monday morning, and company B says, nah, you can go live wherever you want, and we're going to give you can maintain your headquarters salary, your San Francisco level salary, or your Toronto level salary. And company C says, okay, you can work remotely, but you have to keep telling us where you're living at any given time because we're going to do a cost of living adjustment on your salary. So you're a talented software programmer. Which company are you going to work for, right? Either company B or go start your own thing in Dubai, right? And build a team around you, or obviously cloud native. Even the traditional type of companies that I'm talking about are now competing with cloud native companies that don't really care at all about location. So this is the most intense phase of the war for talent that we'll ever have experienced in history, right? And it's just getting warmed up as a result of the geography-free nature of digital services work, which is 40% perhaps, an estimated 40% of the world's labor force, a very significant number, and growing, of course, because that's our measurement from roughly before the pandemic. I mean, can you imagine how much larger it's going to be after the pandemic?
For employers, you've touched a bit on this, but maybe give us a deeper sense of what is needed to win in that war of talent, if indeed it's just heating up.
Right. So the flexibility that I'm talking about from a human resources standpoint is obviously one thing. So see the world through the eyes, of the young, talented, employee, and what do they want? So accommodating that is important, but not, sort of to the ends of the earth. I think that there's going to be some interesting compromises because retention traditionally, derives from loyalty, and retention are related to obviously compensation. B, internal mobility, I got to work in this office and that office and switch to this team and that team. And also the geographic mobility. I got to actually travel around the multinationals ecosystem. And then the third thing is training. So they paid for my MBA. I got upskilling. We have a great lecture series. I got mentored. So these are, again, compensation, mobility, training have been the three pillars. The fourth now is flexibility, right? Around wellness, 4-day work week, and obviously geography, this sort of thing. So those are, I would say, the pillars that employers have to consider.
For employees, what skills are you seeing growing in demand and will be really differentiators competitively in the years ahead?
Well, actually, so remote, being in a remote team, or being either a capable participant or an active leader of such a team, obviously a willingness to go in person. So one of the hybrid options that I see emerging that makes sense is that smart companies are saying, okay, I get it, you want to be remote, but here are the 6 hubs in which we're creating satellite offices. And these are like nice cities, towns, whatever. Try to be near these places because they have good airports, and we'll have a monthly meeting in that city, or to the extent that business travel resumes, we want you to be close enough to that airport. And that's like a nice, flexible, middle kind of compromise that of geography and remoteness, balancing those two. So playing ball with that kind of thing obviously will score you points right now.
Parag, if we had this conversation a couple of years ago and I asked you what are you most concerned about disrupting your thesis, you might have said, well, a global pandemic. As you look forward through the 2020s, what do you think could be the biggest whether it's a black swan or another disruptive event that could change the course of what you've laid out?
So, just to be clear, the mass migration scenario is just that. It's a scenario. It's not a guarantee. It's a scenario that I prefer because I think that migration is more a solution to problems than the problem itself. But that doesn't mean that it's going to happen. And in fact, of the 4 scenarios in the book, regional fortresses, new Middle Ages, barbarians at the gate, and Northern Lights, only one of those is a positive scenario in which we actually do undertake this large-scale, peaceful, gradual resettlement and circularity of the human population. The rest of the scenarios are not particularly, warm and fuzzy at all. So in terms of, the counterexamples or the hurdles that stand in the way, it's reality. Most of reality is not yet accommodating, but I do think that there's basically 2 kinds of countries in my view. Those that in the northern world, those that realize that they have these labor shortages and need to actually make migration, skilled migration, more efficient into their countries, and those that haven't realized it and therefore will be losers in this war for talent that I'm talking about. But I would say the primary, burden or the primary obstacle is just the fact that we may not be appreciating just how rapidly this demographic deflation is happening and how rapidly we need to compensate for it. Again, Canada being an exception because you have realized it. And then, of course, the pace of climate change and just how devastating that is for societies that are also currently the home for the majority of the world's young people, which is really our future global civilizational demographic. So underestimating those 2 things leads to collective ruin.
As we wrap up, Parag, I wonder if you can point to one thing that we should all focus on to get us to that better scenario than the more negative outcomes you lay out in your book.
Mm-hmm. Well, here's the thing. We have COP26 as the, center of people's attention, and so much of the focus is on, mitigation, right? How do we reduce greenhouse gas emissions, decarbonize industries, do carbon capture, storage, even geoengineering? And I support every one of those Manhattan projects. However, it's not enough. Not only is it not enough in terms of mitigating climate change potentially, but it's not near. It doesn't speak at all to adaptation. And I'm in the camp that says right now, today, as we speak, even as we make our best efforts at climate mitigation, there are billions of people who need support with adaptation. And I want us to balance out those agendas, balance out those priorities. And again, the best way to adapt is to move, right? Literally to physically move away. And that's not just for poor countries. That's happening when there's extreme flooding in Germany. It's happening when there are forest fires in the United States. Wealthy people and poor people are affected significantly all across the world. So I want us to take seriously the adaptation agenda as much as we do the mitigation agenda.
Parag, this has been an exceptional conversation as always. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, John. Such a pleasure.